You are listening to the Happiest Lives podcast with Jill Lillard, episode 144.
Welcome to the Happiest Lives podcast, where you'll learn to think better, feel better, and become the woman God says you already are. Here's your host, Jill Lillard.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Happiest Lives podcast. We're starting a new series today, and I'm really excited about it. I thought about doing this some time ago, and it felt like it just wasn't time, but now it is time. I feel like this is what the Lord's calling me to do this month. So this series is called When Self-Help Isn't Helping. And what this series is really about is grace, truth, and the subtle worldviews that are shaping our lives, often without us even realizing it. Now, this isn't a series about rejecting growth. It's not anti-therapy. It's not anti-self-awareness. It's not about throwing things away. It is about recentering, because a lot of us are really trying in life and we are tired. We aren't burnt out. We're not falling apart. We are just maybe feeling a little bit heavy and you aren't sure why. I think a part of what we're carrying is responsibility that was never meant to sit entirely on us. So one of the things I remember learning when I was in seminary, this was in an apologetics class, is that every worldview has at least one point of truth. And that's what makes it compelling. If an idea had no truth in it at all, no one would follow it. It wouldn't spread. It wouldn't stick. But that's also how we drift. Because when something sounds mostly right, when it overlaps with scripture and places, when it uses language we already trust, we don't usually stop to ask what it's leaving out. And that's important because most drift doesn't happen through outright rejection of God. It happens through addition. We add systems, we add strategies, we add ways of coping and managing and staying steady. And over time, those things subtly, slowly take on more weight than they were ever meant to carry. Now, this isn't new. People have always been shaped by the ideas around them. If you read scripture, you see this pattern everywhere. God's people rarely stop believing in him. They just start trusting something else alongside him. So what feels different now is how constant and how close that influence has become. These ideas don't just come through teachers or institutions anymore. They come through your phone, social media, movies, podcasts, books, therapy language, even church culture. So their impact on us, how they form us, isn't usually big and bold and loud. It's not confrontational. It's not like someone arguing with you. It just seems to slowly happen through repetition, through familiarity. And I don't think that's something we need to be afraid of, but I do think it's something we need to be aware of, because you don't have to choose a worldview to be shaped by it. You just have to live inside it long enough. Here's what I've been noticing. Most of the women I work with are genuinely connected to God. Their faith is important to them. Prayer is a part of their life. They read the Bible. They love Jesus. They care about becoming more like him, being shaped in his image and growing. They want to live faithful lives. And they're also very capable. They've learned how to manage their emotions, how to think clearly, how to stay regulated when something feels hard, how to keep moving forward. Those skills are good gifts. And when you read scripture, you realize this isn't new. God's people have always been tempted to rely on something other than him. What changes is what that something is. So over time, those skills, that capability can start carrying more weight than it was meant to. Not because God is not present anymore, but because competence is nearby and it works. So faith stays present, prayer stays present, but it's no longer doing the heavy lifting. God becomes someone we consult rather than the place we rest. And this usually shows up in really ordinary moments. Something goes wrong. A conversation doesn't go the way that you hoped it would. You get an email that tightens your chest. A relationship feels off. And before there's prayer, There's movement. I know I'm guilty of that. My mind starts working. What should I say? What's the right response here? How do I need to think about this so I don't spiral? What's the most mature way to handle this? Now, none of those questions are bad. They are thoughtful questions. They're responsible, but they come fast, and prayer comes later. Not because you don't believe in God, nor because you're trying to do this on your own, but because you've learned how to manage first. You've learned how to steady yourself, how to regulate, how to keep things from tipping too far. So you do what you know how to do. And then, sometimes much later, you invite God into what you've already decided. Not as the source, more like support. And again, this is not a rebellious act. It's adapting. It's competence, doing what competence does. Here's another way that this might show up. Nothing is technically wrong. Your life's fine. Your relationships are fine. Your faith's intact. But you notice this low-level pressure to stay okay, to not need too much, to not feel too much, to not make things heavier than they already are. So when sadness shows up, you manage it. When disappointment shows up, you reframe it. When grief brushes up against you, you keep it moving. Again, those skills work. They keep life functional. They keep things from unraveling. But over time, they also teach you something subtly, that being steady is more important than being honest. That faith looks like composure. That maturity means not needing much. And God stays present in all of this. You still believe, you still pray, you still trust, but more and more you're trusting your ability to stay regulated. Not because you've chosen that on purpose, but because it's rewarded, it's praised, it works until it doesn't. And what finally tips you off isn't failure, it is exhaustion. You are fatigued. The gospel was never meant to be lived from a place of emotional self-sufficiency. And this is where I start to notice the difference between consulting God and resting in God. Consulting God usually comes after I've already done a lot of work. I've thought it through, I've regulated myself, I've come up with a plan, maybe I've done some heart scans, some models, and then I pray. Something like, Lord, help this go well. God, give me wisdom here. Please bless what I'm about to do. Now, those are real prayers, but resting in God feels different. Resting sounds more like, Lord, I don't actually know what to do. Jesus, I need clarity. I feel exposed here. There's less movement in it, less control. Consulting keeps me active. Resting asks me to pause. Consulting lets me stay competent, and resting requires me to be needy. And if I'm honest, resting is harder, not because I don't trust God, but because I don't trust not holding things together. So it makes sense that we drift toward consulting. It lets us keep functioning. It lets us stay steady. But Scripture keeps inviting us somewhere deeper, not away from responsibility, but toward dependence. This is where the idea of worldviews really matters. Every one of us lives inside a worldview. So a worldview is just a set of assumptions you are already carrying around about things like, how does change happen? Where does peace come from? What do I do with pain when it shows up? Who's responsible for fixing things? What do I rely on when life feels hard? Most of us didn't sit down and choose these assumptions. We absorb them through what we hear, through what we repeat, through what gets rewarded. And a lot of what we've absorbed sounds good because parts of it are. Self-help culture values responsibility. That matters. Our choices matter. But when responsibility gets disconnected from dependence, the message becomes, it's on you to fix this. Stoicism values restraint and composure. There's wisdom in not reacting to every emotion. But when restraint becomes the goal, vulnerability starts to feel unsafe. Hey, I just want to let you know my signature class is back. It's called The 4 Things You Must Do to Become the Happiest Wife. And no worries, if you're not married, this can help you with any relationship. I've completely redone it, re-recorded the lessons, and updated the workbook, and it's free. If you've never gone through it or it's been a while, this is a really good time to take a look. If you feel stuck, frustrated, or disappointed in your relationship, then I'll walk you through 4 shifts that can change how you think, how you respond, and how you show up. You can check it out at myhappyvault.com or in the show notes. There's a link. Now let's get back to it. Positive thinking values hope. Hope is biblical, but when hope doesn't leave room for sorrow, we end up skipping over grief instead of moving through it. Manifestation culture values belief. It emphasizes focus and intention, but it relocates sovereignty, placing the weight of outcomes on your inner world rather than on God. Hustle culture values diligence. Scripture affirms hard work, but when diligence becomes the measure of worth, rest turns into something you earn instead of something you receive. Each of these contains a piece of truth. That's why they work. But none of them can carry the full weight of transformation. Once you start seeing the worldviews we're swimming in, something else becomes more clear. It makes sense that we default to consulting instead of resting. The air we breathe rewards competence. It rewards clarity. It rewards people who can keep it together. Dependence doesn't get much airtime. So before we go back to scripture, I want to slow this down for a minute because dependence is one of those words we think we understand, but usually only in theory. Dependence doesn't usually look flashy. It doesn't mean you stop thinking. It doesn't mean you stop acting. And it doesn't mean you fall apart. Most of the time, dependence looks like pausing before you do the right thing, letting yourself feel the discomfort of not knowing what to do yet, not rushing to regulate, reframe, or resolve. Dependence sounds like, I don't know what this means yet. I'm not sure how to handle this. I feel very vulnerable right now. And then not immediately fixing that feeling. That's why dependence feels so vulnerable. Competence gives you distance from your need, and dependence brings you closer to it. And scripture never treats that closeness as immaturity. It treats it as honesty. Jesus doesn't say, figure it out, then come to me. He says, abide, which isn't an action word. It's a staying word. Dependence is staying present long enough for God to be the source, not just the support. And that doesn't mean you never act. It means action comes after resting, not instead of it. After listening, after waiting, after letting God carry the weight for a moment before you decide what to pick up. Now, I know that's hard for me. Most of us don't resist dependence because we don't trust God. We resist it because we don't like how exposed it feels, because it slows us down. I don't like to be slowed down. I don't like to wait. Dependence interrupts the identity we've built around being capable. And yet, this is where scripture keeps pointing, not toward less responsibility, but toward shared load bearing. And when you read the Bible, you realize God has been inviting his people into this kind of dependence all along. Scripture gives the same invitation over and over again. Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Not less, nothing. Here's how I like to think about that. A branch can still look alive and active after it's cut off. It just can't keep producing fruit. So Jesus isn't talking about activity. He's talking about source. You can stay busy. You can keep functioning. You can even look healthy. But fruit, real lasting change, requires connection. Then Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. That word lean is important. Everyone leans on something. We all put weight somewhere when we feel life's uncertain. The question isn't whether you're leaning, it's where the weight is going. Scripture isn't warning us against thinking, it's warning us against letting our thinking become the thing that holds us up. And Psalms 127 says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain." That verse isn't anti-effort, it's anti-self-sufficiency. It doesn't say, don't build. It says, pay attention to who's carrying the load. You can plan, you can build, you can grow, but when the Lord isn't the source, the effort eventually runs hollow. This is really important because many of us aren't spiritually disconnected. We're spiritually busy, still serving, still showing up, still doing meaningful things, but increasingly exhausted because we're running on stored energy instead of ongoing connection. And Scripture keeps calling us back to the same center again and again. Not because effort is wrong, but because dependence is essential. So before we wrap this up, I want to tell you where we're going next, because this series is very intentional. The first episode is about being aware. It's about noticing what has been shaping your life. In the episodes ahead, we're going to look at some of the most common ways we learn to stay steady, ways that often sound wise, disciplined, or even spiritual. We'll talk about things like emotional control, hustle, self-empowerment, and performance. And we'll ask a simple question: where do these help? And where do they start carrying weight they were never meant to carry? We're not throwing wisdom away. We're putting it in its proper place. And then we're going to come back to grace, not as an idea, but as the actual engine of transformation. Grace that doesn't lower the call, grace that supplies the power to live it. Each episode will include a simple spiritual practice, not to fix yourself, but to help you notice where your trust is actually resting. Because this series isn't about managing yourself better. It's about living in relationship with God, where grace supplies what truth invites and love becomes the aim. And if you want a simple tool to help you track what's shaping you, you can download the worldview discernment chart for free. This is something I have created that looks at some very popular worldviews today, and you can kind of see how those might be influencing your thinking and have a better understanding. You'll find it at myhappyvault.com/worldview. It's not a scorecard, it's a mirror, and it's a really helpful place to start. So here's the question I want you to sit with this week. Not to fix, not to judge, just to notice. What am I relying on right now to feel okay, to change, or to feel secure? When you want peace or clarity or control, where do you instinctively turn? That answer isn't the problem, it is information. So once a day this week, pause and pray this: Lord, where am I relying on right now to feel okay, to change, or to feel secure? That's it. You don't have to correct it. I don't want you to come up with an action plan. No spiritual spin. This isn't a prayer of confession. It's a prayer of orientation. So here's the takeaway for today. Pay attention to what's forming you and what it's asking you to rely on. That awareness alone changes more than we think. I'm really glad you're here for this series. We'll keep going next week. Before we wrap up, let me just leave you with something to think about. Do you ever catch yourself thinking, why won't he support me? Why doesn't he see this the way I do? If he really loved me, wouldn't he change? That's a really easy place to land. Most of us go there at some point, and there's nothing wrong with wanting him to change. But when your focus stays there, you end up stuck, waiting on something outside of you to shift so you can feel better. And that's where a lot of frustration builds, because you don't have a clear way to work through what's happening inside you. That's what I teach inside of my free mini course, The 4 Things You Must Do to Become the Happiest Wife. It walks you through a different way to approach this, how how to think, respond, and be the woman that you are proud of at the end of the day without getting pulled into the same patterns over and over and over again. It's built around marriage, but it applies anywhere you feel stuck in your reactions or relationships. You can find it at myhappyvault.com, or in the show notes, you can also find a link. All right, I'll see you next time.